Hello, and thank you for watching. This is Professor Ryan Paul, and this is the lecture on the Odyssey Books 19 through 21. Book 19, Penelope and Her Guest. So we begin with Odysseus and Telemachus once more conferring and talking about their plans, what they're going to do, how they're going to defeat the suitors. And Odysseus has Telemachus go and gather up all the household weapons and hide them so that the suitors will not have anything to defend themselves with. Penelope now wishes to speak with the guest, as she had asked for in the previous book. So she and her maids descend from the chamber to speak with the guest. And once more, Melantho, one of Penelope's handmaidens, mocks Odysseus, insults him for being a stranger, for being poor and old, and says he should leave, that he's a beggar, etc., etc. And both Odysseus and Penelope chastise her and say that she's threatened her with death for her rude behavior. And as the two start to speak, we see that they engage in this subtle kind of testing back and forth. Penelope asks him who he is, where he's from, what's his story, but he deflects her questions. He says, I've got too much grief, I don't want to go on forever with my sadness. So he deflects her questions in order to test her. And she is then prompted to speak of her own grief and just how sad she is. So here it's Odysseus trying to find out just how much does his wife really miss him. And so Penelope says, part of what she says as she's talking about her own sadness, Odysseus, if he could return to tend my life, the renown I had would only grow in glory. Now my life is torment. I yearn for Odysseus, always my heart pines away, and now I cannot escape a marriage, nor can I contrive a deft way out. She is told of the story of how she was weaving the burial shroud for Odysseus's father, but unweaving it at night, but she eventually was caught, and so now she has no way to escape the marriage that she's supposed to make with one of these suitors. After hearing her grief, Odysseus then tells his own tale, or the concocted tale, the made-up story about the life of this character that he's playing. Talks about how he was born on Crete, his father, etc., and says he met Odysseus before he went to Troy. So he knows him from way back, 20 years ago, almost, is when he met Odysseus, he says. And as he's telling this tale, we see why he's doing so. We see how it helps him to, again, test Penelope's loyalty. Falsehoods all, but he gave his falsehoods all the ring of truth. As she listened on, her tears flowed and soaked her cheeks, weeping for him, her husband, sitting there beside her. Odysseus's heart went out to his grief-stricken wife, but under his lids his eyes remained stock still. His guile fought back his tears. So he feels sympathy, he feels moved at his wife's sadness, but it's part of his test. He can't show openly his own feelings for her until he has conquered the suitors. In her turn, Penelope then tests the stranger. She says, well, you say you've seen Odysseus, but what was he wearing? Describe him to me. So Odysseus says, well, he was wearing all these wonderful clothes, and describes them in great detail, and these were the people that were with him, his servants, and they all respected him so much. So he proves to Penelope that he's telling the truth. And she says, those were the clothes that I gave him. And so she's moved, of course, and trusts him now from this story. And then the guest says, I've also heard that Odysseus is returning. I heard that he's on his way back as we speak. He says to her, but dry your tears and take my words to heart. I will tell you the whole truth and hide nothing. I have heard that Odysseus now, at last, is on his way. The man is still alive, and he's bringing home a royal hoard of treasure. In fact, Odysseus would have been here beside you long ago, but he thought it the better, shrewder course to recoup his fortunes roving through the world. So Notice how he says, well, he wasn't trapped with a goddess for 7 years, forced to have sex with her every night, which probably wouldn't go over too well with his wife. So he says, oh, he's been getting treasure for you, treasure for his house, treasure that will last 10 generations, which is partially true, but he leaves out certain aspects of what Odysseus has encountered. Penelope, who now has been moved by her guest's story and what he suffered, she offers, of course, as a good woman does, a good queen, hospitality. And she tells her maids that they will bathe and clothe the guest in the morning, that they should make him a luxurious bed. But he says, I don't need anything lavish. I don't need a special bed, a nice bed. I can sleep on the ground, just a few rugs or skins to keep me warm. And I don't need to be bathed by your young maidens. I don't need anything lavish like that. So he's very humble, which Penelope appreciates. And he says, I know that the young maids don't want to touch me because I'm old and dirty and a beggar, but if there's an old trustworthy servant who wouldn't mind, she can wash my feet. And of course, this takes us to old Euryclea, who we've seen before, the nurse, and she calls out once more her grief for Odysseus. She says, oh, I've been here forever, I miss him, and wow, you look so much like my old master. You're so much like him. And so she washes his feet. But as she's doing so, Odysseus suddenly remembers his scar that she will know him by. She'll recognize him if she sees it. And of course, he's right. She does recognize the scar, and we get the story of where it came from. In a flash, she knew the scar, that old wound made years ago by a boar's white tusk, when Odysseus went to Parnassus, out to see Autolycus and his sons. Here, as the hunters closed in for the kill, he crashed from his lair, his razor back bristling, his eyes flashing fire, and charging up to the hunt, he stopped at bay. And Odysseus rushed him first, shaking his long spear in a sturdy hand, wild to strike, but the boar struck faster, lunging in on the slant, a tusk thrusting up over the boy's knee, gouging a deep strip of flesh, but it never hit the bone. Odysseus thrust and struck, stabbing the beast's right shoulder, a glint of bronze. The point ripped clean through, and down in the dust he dropped. So it's this great moment when a young Odysseus was injured but still killed this wild, dangerous boar, won out ultimately, but was left scarred by it. Euryclea is, of course, thrilled that her master's returned, and she wants to tell Penelope, but Odysseus says, don't say anything, and if you do, in fact, I'll kill you when I kill all the rest of the bad servants who've betrayed me. And she says, no, 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 of course I will keep your secret, I'm your loyal servant, and she pledges her loyalty to Odysseus. And in their last moment before Penelope goes off to bed, she asks the stranger for a bit of advice. She's tormented by her grief. Should she stay with her son as she wishes to, or marry one of these guys, as her son and her parents and all the suitors are telling her to? But she wants to remain loyal to her husband, so what should she do? And she says, I had this dream. Can you tell me what it means? In the dream, there were a flock of geese in my house, and an eagle came and slaughtered them all. And then the eagle spoke to me and said, those geese were your suitors, and I am your husband. Odysseus says, that's right. That's what your dream is telling you, that your husband is going to return and kill the suitors. So he confirms its meaning. And she says, well, I can't hold them off anymore, so I'm going to give them a test. If one of them can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through this row of axes, he will be the one to marry me. And Odysseus, in disguise, says, that's a great plan. I think you should set this in motion immediately. So some questions to consider about Book 19. Odysseus and Penelope have this conversation where they're testing each other back and forth. What's significant about this testing? What does it reveal about what they're concerned about, what they're worried about, their fears, what they want from the other person? Think about the characters of the good servant and the bad servant in this book and in the next couple books as well. We have Melantho compared to Eurycleia. So again, what's the difference between a good servant and a bad servant? What defines one or the other? How are they compared in terms of their attitudes, behavior, etc.? And then the significance of Odysseus' scar and the nurse's recognition, this moment. It's a very human moment. It's a very realistic moment that this wound on someone's body would mark out their identity. So what do you think is symbolic or meaningful? What does that represent? That it's a bodily injury that reveals Odysseus' identity, that it's a scar that he received when hunting. Is there anything meaningful about that story or what it tells us about Odysseus or about this moment of recognition itself? So think about that encounter and its importance. Book 20, Portents Gather. So as Odysseus then goes off to bed, as he's waiting to sleep, he hears the suitors cavorting about with the maids. And he's just furious about this, both at the suitors and at the maids themselves. And he can't sleep because of his rage and his worry over the coming battle. So Athena visits him and reassures him in order to help him sleep. When Odysseus tells Athena why he's still awake, we get a rather important moment, though, a very telling moment that cuts right to the heart of the issues with revenge and the heroic code and the sort of paradox, the problem at the center of it. How can I get these shameless suitors in my clutches, single-handed, braving an army always camped inside? There's another worry that haunts me even more. What if I kill them, thanks to you and Zeus? How do I run from under their avengers? So it's going to be hard enough to kill them, but even if I do, what's going to happen next when their families come to take revenge? Again, Athena reassures him, says there's not going to be any problems. And while this is going on, Penelope has another dream, and she wakes from it. And she cries out once more about her great grief and how miserable she is. And she wishes that she would rather die than marry someone else. Because in her dream, she had dreamt that Odysseus had returned. And she wishes for him, she wishes to die thinking about him so that that will be her last and eternal memory. Some words that she speaks in her grief. May the gods who rule Olympus blot me out, so I can plunge beneath this loathsome earth with the image of Odysseus vivid in my mind. Never let me warm the heart of a weaker man. Even my dreams torment me, sent by wicked spirits. Again, just this night, someone lay beside me, like Odysseus to the life, when he embarked with his men-at-arms. My heart raced with joy. No dream, I thought, the waking truth at last. So it's a dream both of Odysseus as he was in the past, but also a foreshadowing, a foretelling of Odysseus who is going to return and lay beside her once more. So the dream works to operate both going into the past and into the future. So Odysseus hears his wife cry out, and he asks Zeus for a sign. And he's given a sign that confirms his hopes, a thunder strike from Zeus. And when an old woman, the one old woman who's still working, grinding the grain for the household, hears this, she lets out a prayer of her own. She says, so poor as I am, grant me my prayer as well. Let this day be the last these suitors bolt their groaning feasts in King Odysseus' house. These brutes who break their knees, heart-wrenching labor, grinding their grain, now let them eat their last. So she calls out, hoping for them to die, and as we'll learn in a couple books, her prayer will be granted. This is the last day of the suitors feasting in Odysseus' home. So then we have a scene of a number of the servants preparing Eurycleia organizes the cleaning of the palace, and we have a rather interesting description of her saying, put this out, clean this area up, and so forth. So we get that domestic, very, very authentic domestic portrayal. Eumaeus the swineherd arrives and greets Odysseus as, how have they been treating you? Have the suitors been kind, or have they been cruel, as they usually are? Melanthius the goatherd comes and then mocks them once again, insults the stranger for being a beggar. And finally, Philotius, a new character, a cowherd, comes, and he also welcomes the guest. And when Odysseus questions him, he speaks about how much he misses his old master and how good his old master was. So we have the three good servants, Eurycleia, Eumaeus, and Philotius, and the bad servant, Melanthius. For their part, the suitors are plotting against Telemachus, but they see another omen, this time an eagle clutching a dove. And Amphinomus, one of the few decent suitors, says, this is not a good sign, we're not going to succeed. So he tells them, let's just forbear and let's concentrate on feasting, he says, but let's not murder Telemachus, because it won't turn out well for us. And as they are all feasting, Athena sends a kind of madness on the suitors. They mock Telemachus as he tries to stand up for himself and declares himself the master of the household, and that they should listen to what he has to say. They continue to insult the guests. They throw things at him. And Athena makes them laugh hysterically and uncontrollably, so much so that Theoclymenus, the seer, is disturbed by what he sees. He has a vision of their fate, and he calls out to them that they're taken by some kind of terror, and that they are doomed. So among some of the last things we read in Book 20 are Theoclymenus's words to the suitors. He says, night shrouds your heads, your faces down to your knees. Cries of mourning are bursting into fire, cheeks rivering tears, the walls and the handsome crossbeams dripping dank with blood. Ghosts, look, thronging the entrance, thronging the court, go trooping down to the world of death and darkness. The sun is blotted out of the sky. Look there, a lethal mist spreads all across the earth. So this is the vision that he has of the coming doom for the suitors, and they, of course, just mock him. And thus we end Book 20. In this book, think about, why is there such an intense focus on supernatural signs and dreams? What do these signs and dreams mean? How are they interpreted? What is it that they take from them in order to give some sort of meaning to them? And what does this focus on omens and portents suggest, again, about the Greek understanding of reality, fate, destiny? Right? So it's very different from our own understanding. And how is it that they understood the way one existed in the world, and how you read the world around you to understand what was going to happen, what you should do, what the gods wanted, etc. And what do Odysseus's fears, those fears that he speaks at the beginning of this book about the avengers of his guests, how do they cut to the heart of the problem with vengeance and with the heroic code? What is the paradox? What is the contradiction? What is the ultimate difficulty associated with this code that they reveal? Book 21, Odysseus strings his bow. So Penelope goes to the vault of Odysseus, and we get this description of the doors of the vault and the key, and everything is described in great detail to show how well constructed it is, how wealthy Odysseus is. And she gets his mighty bow, his famous bow that has been kept in storage. And we learn about how he received this bow. It was a gift from Iphitus when they met years prior. And it was a gift that secured their friendship. We also learn that Iphitus was later killed by Hercules. And so to memorialize his friend and his friendship, Odysseus never takes the bow out overseas into battle. He only uses it to hunt. So Penelope takes the bow and issues the challenge to the suitors. Listen to me, my overbearing friends, you who plague this palace night and day, drinking, eating us out of house and home. Here is the prize at issue, right before you. Look. I set before you the great bow of King Odysseus now, the hand that can string this bow with greatest ease, that shoots an arrow clean through all 12 axes. He is the man I follow. So she lays out the challenge to the suitors, says whoever can take this will win my hand in marriage. Telemachus, who of course knows what's going to happen, knows what the plan is, laughingly encourages the suitors to try it. He tries himself. He says, let me try it. Maybe I can that way prevent a lesser man from marrying my mother. And he tries 3 times but is unable to do it. And he's about to get it on the 4th try, but Odysseus gives him a nod, says don't do it. So Telemachus ultimately cannot string the bow. And then he says to spur the suitors on, come, my betters, so much stronger than I am, try the bow and finish off the contest. So he sets them up for this contest by showing his own weakness and building them up, puffing them up a little bit. And while the suitors are trying their hand at the bow, Odysseus speaks privately with Philoetius and Eumaeus, the swineherd and the cowherd, and he asks them, what would you do if Odysseus arrived today? Would you fight with him against the suitors, or would you serve the suitors? And they say, we hate them. We would, of course, serve our master. We would fight beside him. And he says, well, he's here. I'm Odysseus. He reveals his scar, shows himself to them, and says, if you fight with me and we win, I will give you property. I'll give you a home. I will find you wives. I will make you brothers to my son Telemachus. And they say, of course, we will aid you. You are our king. And so they make their plans. He tells them what he needs them to do prior to the battle getting started. Of course, the suitors all fail miserably at stringing the bow. Even the mightiest of them can't even get close to it. And so Antinous says, let's wait until tomorrow. Let's feast today. Tomorrow we'll make an offering to Apollo, who is, after all, the archer god, and we'll try again. And they all agree, yes, let's do that. But at this, the guest, that is Odysseus, humbly offers to try for their amusement. He says, for the moment, give me the polished bow now, won't you? So, to amuse you all, I can try my hand, my strength. Is the old force still alive inside these gnarled limbs, or has a life of roaming, years of rough neglect, destroyed it long ago? Now note here, Odysseus in character is being self-effacing, being very humble, saying, oh, I'm just an old man, I wonder if I still have the strength. But Odysseus himself is, in some ways, also saying these words. Does he still have the strength to string his own bow after 20 years? So it's a great moment of suspense and tension where the character is wondering. We as the audience are wondering, will he do it? Partially, of course, we know he's going to do it, but we're caught up in that moment of wondering, does he still have the strength? Has he been beaten down too much? So, of course, the suitors, Antinous leading the way, berates the guest for his offer, and they say, boy, that would really look great if some beggar, some riffraff was able to string the bow, and then what, he's going to marry Penelope? And of course, Penelope says, well, no, he's not going to marry me. Even if he does this, he's just a beggar, but why not let him try? I think it's not a problem. And if he succeeds, I'll give him gifts and send him on his way. At this, however, Telemachus says, Mother, it's time for the men to talk about manly things. Why don't you go to your room and deal with womanly things? And she says, okay. Surprisingly, she acknowledges that this is right, that she should go up and take care of womanly things while he deals with manly things. And Telemachus says, I'm going to let him try. Let's let the guest try. And tells Eumaeus, the swineherd, take the bow to the guest, even though you're being mocked and insulted all the while you're doing it by the suitors. Let him try. And of course, Odysseus strings his bow. So they mocked, but Odysseus, mastermind in action, once he'd handled the great bow and scanned every inch, Then, like an expert singer, skilled at lyre and song, so with his virtuoso ease, Odysseus strung his mighty bow. Horror swept through the suitors, faces blanching white, and Zeus cracked the sky with a bolt, his blazing sign. So Odysseus strings the bow, and it's an interesting comparison. He's like a singer, like a poet, this instrument that he has, but of course it's an instrument of death rather than an instrument of beauty. And the suitors have a taste, have a momentary recognition of something bad is perhaps about to happen when they see just how strong he is, that he can do what none of them could do. And he successfully, of course, shoots the arrow and says, "Look, I won. I did what none of you could do." And then we get perhaps one of the greatest cliffhanger endings of a chapter in all of literary history, as this father and son prepare for battle. He paused with a warning nod, and at that sign, Prince Telemachus, son of King Odysseus, girding his sharp sword on, clamping hand to spear, took his stand by a chair that flanked his father, his bronze spear point glinting now like fire. And so some last questions about Book 21. What is symbolized or represented by the test of the bow? What attributes does it prove in the victor? What is the victor, the person who can successfully accomplish this? What do they prove about themselves, literally and metaphorically? Another way to think about this is, why is it important that Odysseus defeat the suitors at this contest before he kills them? Why is it important to Odysseus himself? Why is it important for us as audience members? What does it do for us reading or hearing this narrative? Why is it important to the logic of the poem, to the logic of Odysseus's journey and his journey to be recognized as the rightful king? Why is this event necessary in that story? Also think about the history of the bow and where Odysseus got it from. What's significant or meaningful about that? And finally, thinking about in this book, but throughout the poem as a whole, but particularly in this book, because we're getting closer and closer to the climactic battle that we know is going to happen, how does Homer keep the suspense and the tension going? And how does he, in fact, even build suspense and tension in this book, leading us to that expectation so that we're primed and ready for the bloodbath that we're going to get in the next book? So the next step, of course, is to watch the final video on the Odyssey on books 22 through 24. The online quiz on the last 6 books is due Saturday this week. You have a little bit of extra time because of the delay in getting the materials put up. And if you have any questions about anything in this lecture, anything else associated with the class, any concerns or about anything, of course, feel free to contact me, phone, text, email, or Blackboard. And otherwise, good luck with your work this week.